My name is Matthew Herbert, and I've made an album called The Horse. It's an album based around a horse skeleton that I bought, and it tells a version of, or a history of music and music technology and musical instruments and the musical imagination, starting with bone flutes and going through real flutes and an orchestra, the London Contemporary Orchestra, and through into bone triggers and electronics, at the same time bringing the horse back to life through music. Really, I set out just to begin to make music with a skeleton. So the first thing I did was I had Henry Dagg make 4 flutes from the leg bones of the horse, and he put beeswax in the top. And then I bought a horse skin drum. We used horse hair that's used in violin bows and cello bows still to this day. We got some of that and a rib bone from the horse, and the musicians made crude bows to play their instruments. And I realized I was starting to just tell a story of a very primitive forms of music, the very earliest forms of music. And so we started to think, well, what would it have been like to be the first musicians? And so I realized from there I was then telling a history of music and musical instruments. So starting with bone flutes and then moving, and then we formed a lyre, which is like a basic harp type instrument, which is one of the very first string instruments. Took the pelvis and put strings across that. Henry Dagg also made that for me. And then from there we moved into amplification and then mechanization. And then from mechanization to electronics, and by the end we're using bone triggers and things like that. So today we have scrapped bits of the horse, well, bits of horses. So we've got a horse, big horse drum, little horse drum, bones in a bag, got some ribs, got a shoulder blade, the bone flutes that Henry Dagg made. So we are here to mechanize the horse. That's the plan, is to mechanize, sort of do the leap in music from just playing what we can to like outsourcing our movement to machinery. And as the story progresses, what happens is, of course, is that I then started to look for all the different ephemera and stories and objects around horses that can help tell the story of these different forms of exploitation. So looked at bits that went between their teeth and whips and horseshoes, and then the other things like trophies that you might win at a horse racing event, or representations of horses. Like, so I found money with horses printed on it from Ireland from the 60s. And so I had all this accumulation of objects which Seb and Edward used in a percussion recording context whilst we were making the record. But also I bought a cement mixer and put it in, this sort of churn of trying to represent the churn of all an accumulation of all these different forms of exploitation, and trying to squeeze as much out of the horse as possible in service almost entirely for the benefit of humans. And so these objects became part of the fabric of the record as much as the skeleton did. Just at the heart of the record really is an exploration of different materials and different textures, because you start with bone and skin, and then you move into metal and plastic and coins and things like that. And then eventually by the end of the record you come back to bone, and then eventually you hear real horses and you hear its voice and you hear it breathing. One of the key relationships for me on the record is with Hugh Brunt, who is an arranger, a conductor, and one half of the London Contemporary Orchestra. And with him and their musicians, we tried to sort of reinvent the way you might work with an orchestra in a studio. So we did 2 sessions. The first session was with no music and was largely around improvisation, which is never something that is normally part of working with a more classical orchestra. I brought the skeleton and I gave them the bone flutes and the ribs and things, and we tried to reimagine what it would have been like to play their instruments for the first time, to create a palette of sounds, to try and discover things together. And I took away all of those recordings and chopped them up, and then wrote with those and composed with those, and then a second recording session where I brought music this time and that would accompany what they'd previously recorded and I'd remanipulated, and had them play on top of what they'd already played with. We got to try new techniques. So, for example, using looping stations actually in the recording session, getting them to play phrases and adding them to each other. So for me, one of the really exciting parts of this record was actually finding new processes, new ways of working with orchestral classical musicians, as well as with jazz musicians who are used to improvisation and things. So it's like trying to make the process as exploratory as possible, so that hopefully the music has some of that curiosity or has some of that invention that I'm hoping to describe that humans have had over the last 40, 50,000 years that we've been making music. One of the surprising things to me about making the record, although looking back on it, it doesn't seem that surprising that it became like this, but it became quite magical, quite pagan, quite spiritual, quite shamanic, quite ritualistic. And there I was in my studio banging this horse drum and then blowing through the horse's legs, and I had a shamanic rattle, and actually it started to feel like a summoning. We're not far from my studio, and I live and work rurally, so it became very sort of open out to the world of, like, you know, these horses aren't my horses, but they live on the land near me. And just before we finished the record, in fact, a metal detectorist came to our land, came in within an hour, had dug up a little Bronze Age horse, which would have been probably, it's hard to know exactly, but it's probably a little offering to the horse gods. And this is the cover of the album, actually. This became the cover of the album, but it was very hard to not find yourself in a very unusual, spiritual, fantastical, magical, weird, slightly uncomfortable, shamanistic state. Also, the record just gets faster and faster and wilder, and at the end suddenly a horse appears. And ultimately that's what the record is about, is trying to bring back some life, to offer a kind of freedom to this horse that was a racehorse, that was bred for a particular reason, that was whipped and raced for money, none of which it saw. And ultimately for it to reach some kind of transcendence, for it to exist beyond just a memory and beyond just a set of bones.